Welcome to our week when we're focusing mostly on justice, and in this case, of course, distributive justice. Um, Distributive justice are normative principles designed to guide the allocation of the benefits and burdens of economic activity in order to achieve some acceptable level of fairness and equity in a society or in a community. And the mode of reasoning analogy, which we've used all along to help you kind of get an immediate grasp of a concept, in this case it's kind of a lifeboat exercise. Distributive justice has put us in a situation where there are a group of people who have limited resources. How do those limited resources get distributed? And a lifeboat exercise, probably most of you have had the experience of a lifeboat exercise at one point or another, and know that you're thrown together in the lifeboat and you have to decide, who stays in the lifeboat and who goes overboard, because the lifeboat's going to sink if everyone stays. So it's this, we have limited resources, and that limited resource is the lifeboat itself, or in some cases it's how much food is on the lifeboat or how much water is in the lifeboat, and we can supply water or food for only 10 people and there are 15. So who has to go overboard, who has to be sacrificed, that sort of thing. Distributive justice is saying society makes these decisions all the time. Whether they're making those decisions consciously or not, these decisions are being made. There are winners and losers in society, and therefore appropriate principles have to be applied here. It can't just be arbitrary or willy-nilly, or who's got the most money or something like that is a very arbitrary standard according to most theories of distributive justice. So it's an attempt to create a more stable and a more substantial set of principles. There are a number of theories of distributive justice, and in your reading for today, you read about 6 or 7 of those. I'm going to quickly kind of remind you of each one of those theories, and then I'm going to go much deeper into one of those theories, which wasn't really well described in your reading. It's not very thorough, and it deserves to have a much more thorough treatment. First of all, there's strict egalitarianism, a very simple kind of distributive justice principle, which states that every person should have the same level of material goods and services. It's merely taking all the resources in society and divvying it up according to the number of people in society. So if we have 10 apples and 10 people, everybody gets an apple. If we have 5 apples and 10 people, everybody gets half an apple kind of distribution. Strict egalitarianism. Resource egalitarianism is similar, of course, the use of the term egalitarianism, but in resource egalitarianism, it's really focused on the starting point. The starting point is equal. However, the outcomes are determined by the free use of the resources. Therefore, everyone isn't assured equal resources throughout their lifetime or throughout the time period in which we're doing this analysis. So it's the kind of theory that suggests, well, at some point in a person's life, everyone gets the same resources, the same education, the same amount of food, clothing, shelter, same number of opportunities in regards to jobs, the same kind of training, etc., and so forth. But once everyone has gotten this set of resources, whatever they may be, then it's really up to them to do with those resources what they will. And if they squander those resources, oops, oh well. It's not up to the society then to step in and give them more resources. That would be unfair. If the person, applies themselves and does something very good with those resources, and well, then good for them. That's how resource egalitarian works. We all begin with an equal set of resources. What we do with them is up to us. Utilitarianism, something we've really already discussed, is discussed in our reading under the idea of welfare principle. And it's really utilitarianism. One must choose the option that maximizes the overall utility or welfare. It's not strict utilitarianism, egalitarianism. Utilitarianism simply says that we have to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. That may not be exactly giving 10 apples to 10 people. It may be that two of the people in that group of 10 are in greater need and should get more than one apple. They could get one apple and a quarter of another apple, and that there are others in the group who don't need quite as much, and it's those people will take a little bit of their apple and give it to the people who need more. In any case, a utilitarian analysis is a bit more complex than simply strict egalitarianism, which is a bit more simplistic in its focus of distribution. Desert-based principles suggest that people should be rewarded for their work activity according to the value of their contribution to the social product. In other words, people should be rewarded, and the resources of society should be distributed according to a person's contribution to that society. So if a person is contributing a whole lot to society, that person should receive a greater share of the resources in that society than others, and should certainly receive even more than those who aren't really contributing much at all. So it's this desert-based principle which seems fair, because at some level there will always be people who contribute more and those who contribute less to the thriving and development of a society. Libertarianism is a distribution that says everyone is entitled to the holdings they possess under the laws of that distribution. Libertarianism is saying that, well, people deserve what they have if they have acquired what they have according to the laws and the rules of that society. As long as they haven't cheated someone out of something, as long as they haven't stolen something, as long as they aren't more or less taking something from someone else, or depriving people of something, then they deserve to have it, even if what they have is much more than everyone else. Even if what they have seems disproportionately large in comparison to what everyone else or what someone else in that society has. Finally, there's Rawls' theory of justice, which is discussed under the heading of the difference principle in your reading. And it's this one that I want to talk about more, because in your reading it gives a couple of paragraphs, but it doesn't give you a really good idea of what Rawls' the full-blown theory of justice had to say about distributive justice. And I'm not saying Rawls per se has the most important voice here. His is a fairly complex one that just needs a little more explanation. Rawls' theory of justice begins with this idea of the original position. And in the original position, a group of people come together for the purpose of deciding on the ground rules for their society. And economic distribution is the normal focus of the theory. I want to begin here by saying that the original position, and really all of Rawls' theory, is a thought experiment. We've run into thought experiments before when we talked about Kant and Kant's third formulation of the categorical imperative, where he was asking us to do this thought experiment about the kingdom of ends. where we kind of magically transform ourselves or transport ourselves into a world where everyone treats each other as an end unto themselves. It's kind of a morally perfect universe. In a similar way, Rawls wants us to do a thought experiment here. The truth is, we're never going to get a group of people to come together for the purpose of deciding on the ground rules of society, with economic distribution as the normal focus. There isn't this kind of group of people who are ever going to do this. And, as we go through the various aspects of the original position, you'll begin to see that this is a thought experiment. It's not actually something that is implementable in a real world. It's a group that's aware of other attempts to write constitutions and regulate economic distribution. In other words, the people who are coming together aren't coming together as ignoramuses, as people who don't really know anything about any other society. They're really coming together with actually quite a bit of knowledge of history, of political science, theories of social construction, philosophy, and other ideas. So they're bringing a lot of ideas to the table. It's kind of a well-educated group, is the assumption. But otherwise, they begin with this clean slate. Again, you have to think of this as a thought experiment, because what happens when you enter the room in the original position is you sort of have this amnesia moment where you've forgotten who and what you were before. So if you were the mayor of the city, walking into the room, once you're in that room, you're no longer the mayor of the city, and you no longer carry any of the baggage that was associated with that role. If you were the garbage man, let's say, same thing. You were garbage person before entering the room. Once you're in the room, the baggage associated with that role that you did play in society is now gone, and you start with a clean slate. And you're standing behind what Rawls called the veil of ignorance. No one knows, no one in the group knows what role you'll play in the new society. So the whole clean slate idea and the veil of ignorance, more or less, is this idea that you come into the room and you forget what you were, and you don't know what you're going to become. You don't know what you were in the old society, you don't know what you will become in the new one. That's, again, why it's a thought experiment. This whole idea of clean slate, veil of ignorance. Rawls believed that there were some characteristics of the original position that would be true for every time one did this thought experiment. He believed that at the end of the proceedings, first of all, the role would be assigned to each individual arbitrarily, like names drawn from a hat. So, not only would we not know what role we were going to play in the new society, our roles were going to be assigned to us arbitrarily. So we could end up with, a wonderful role. We could end up with the worst role in society. We don't know, because it was going to be assigned to us. If in this case, it forces people to be objective and impartial. And for Rawls, he believed that made agreement possible. If in this new society I had a possibility, it was possible for me to be assigned the role of the person who was worst off in that society, I was probably going to make sure that the person who was worse off was, at least doing fairly well. There was a sense of fairness that prevailed due to a lack of bias. That is, since I don't know what role I'm going to play, I'm not going to favor one role over another. If I knew I was going to be mayor of the city, well, the mayor was going to undoubtedly receive a lot of benefits from that society, but since I don't know, I'm not necessarily going to assign those benefits to the mayor. He said the circumstances of the original position are genuinely equal and fair And because of this, the principles agreed to under these conditions have a good claim to be considered the principles of justice. Rawls believed that when we chose principles in the original position, because of what it was, because it was a group of people who didn't know what role they had played or what role they would play, that certain psychological characteristics would take over in the group. He believed that people in the original position would be conservative, not in our traditional sense, not in our sense here in the United States of somebody being liberal or conservative, but conservative in the sense that they wouldn't want to gamble their fortune in this proposed society. As I was saying before, if my role is being assigned to me arbitrarily, and I could be assigned the role of the person who is worst off in that society, well, I'm probably going to make that role at least a livable role in that society, the one in which I have enough food, enough shelter, and enough of the basic needs of society so that I'm not living a miserable life. They will not agree to rules that make it overwhelmingly likely that they will face a grim life of hardship. And so he proposed that ultimately the people in the original position would use what's known as the Maximin rule. And the Maximin rule wasn't something that he made up. The Maximin rule is something that really he's borrowing from game theory. And game theory, here we're not, it's not, game theory isn't something that's game in the sense of, a football game or a basketball game or something of this nature. Game theory is, an actual mathematical academic discipline. And he's borrowing this idea of the Maximin rule, which says one should select the alternative under which the worst that could happen to you is better than the worst that could happen to you under any other alternative. It's an important rule. It's one to think about. It's actually one that is applied by either consciously or unconsciously by most people who are successful in Atlantic City and in Reno and Las Vegas when they go into games of chance. And really game theory in part is setting up situations of games of chance. They use this Maximin rule. What people who are successful in Las Vegas and Atlantic City and Reno are usually not the people, and almost exclusively are not the people who walk in, take their entire bankroll and throw it down on the roulette table. The people who are actually successful in games of chance tend to be people who bet very little and bet only in situations where the odds are in their favor. And so people who actually make money over a long period of time in Las Vegas are people who make money very gradually and very deliberately and actually work at it 8 or 10 hours a day. And they've done the analysis and they've done the math and they know when they need to put down a little bit, not a whole lot of their money, because the odds are slightly in their favor. Because Vegas and Atlantic City and Reno are never going to play games that are enormously in your favor. Occasionally they let things get in your favor, but you have to know when that is and when to do it, when to put your money down. The Maximin rule is more or less one should maximize the minimum. And how does that apply to distributive justice? Well, it applies in the sense that we're trying to maximize the benefit of those who are worst off in the society. As I said, it comes from game theory. Rawls' theory suggests that ultimately we're going to be very conservative. And here's an example. I'm going to give you an example of a very conservative and also a a very risky society. The traditional monarchy, with king at the top, peasants at the bottom, and maybe a few artisans and people in the royal court in between, is a very risky society. Let's say we have 100 people in our room, our original position room, and we choose monarchy. We're really stupid and we don't know what we're doing, and we just said, well, I might be king. And out of the 100 little pieces of paper that we put in our hat, one of them says king, a couple of them say royal court, 3 of them say artisan, and the other 94 say peasant. They say, you're in the onion fields, crawling on your hands and knees, plucking up onions for the rest of your life. Yuck. But so our chances of becoming peasant are quite high. In fact, they're exactly 94%. And our chances of being king are extremely low. In fact, it's 1%. We have a 1% chance. And in fact, in a real monarchy, it would be even less than that we would actually be king or part of the king's family. So this is a very risky society. Monarchies, what Rawls is saying, monarchy is probably not something we would choose. We'd be pretty stupid if we did. On the other hand, there's the strict egalitarian society, which we talked about earlier. This is a very safe and conservative option. It's not, according to Rawls, it's not necessarily the one and only option that we would choose, but nevertheless, it's a much safer option than the very risky option of the monarchy. I mean, in the egalitarian society, obviously, there's almost no need to pass the hat at the end of the day, because everybody more or less knows what their fate in that new society is going to be. Finally, after doing all this deliberation, after doing this great big thought experiment, Rawls said ultimately 2 principles come out of this. First one is that each person should have the equal right to the most extensive total system of basic liberties compatible with a similar system of liberty for all. That is, everyone should be free in this society to assume the roles that they choose to assume, and should have, rights to the basic, needs that they have as human beings. Secondly, social and economic inequalities are to satisfy 2 conditions. So, some were criticizing Rawls and saying that he was really just a socialist and really just an egalitarian, and that ultimately all of this, mental gymnastics was to simply come up with this, new justification for egalitarianism. Rawls said no, inequalities can be tolerated, but they can only be tolerated under 2 conditions. The first one is they are to be attached to positions and offices open to all under conditions of fair and equal opportunity. So anyone and everyone should be able to hold these offices that are higher or better in society. They shouldn't be restricted to certain groups, and they are to be the greatest expected benefit to the least advantaged members of society. If people do assume roles that are of higher value, those roles have to have some kind of positive impact on those who are least advantaged or worst off in society. Finally, I wanted to show you a graph that depicts ways in which Rawls' theory might produce a society that is not strictly egalitarian. Now here's one pie graph of an egalitarian distribution. Each one of the pieces of the pie are exactly the same. No person has one that's different than another. Here is an unequal but more just distribution. Notice the pie is bigger, and any one of even the smallest piece in the unequal but more just distribution is larger than the piece in the egalitarian distribution. This is what more or less what Rawls was arguing, especially when he was arguing with capitalists who said, well, you're just a socialist, or you're just an egalitarian, and you're just condemning capitalism. He said, well, no, capitalism might actually produce a bigger pie, a more productive and a wealthier society. And because it's a wealthier society, those who are least well off in that society may actually be better off than people in a strictly egalitarian society. In that case, it's a more equal or more just distribution. If the smallest piece of pie in an unequal distribution is greater than any piece in the egalitarian one, then the unequal one is the more just society, even though there are inequalities. So this was his final, in so many ways, his final retort to those who were claiming he was just a socialist or just an egalitarian, and that his system of justice really was nothing new, and really was not nearly as developed or complex as he was trying to propose. In any case, that's the more complete description of Rawls' theory of justice, or this difference principle that you were reading in the readings today. Our next topic is going to be the natural law, and look forward to seeing you there in our natural law discussion.